Shalom, Om Swastiastu, Namo Kebajikan. Good afternoon and welcome to Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia Chapter Universitas Indonesia World in a Snap webinar, analyzing the China-India border dispute, developments, and consequences. First of all, let us bring our praise to the Almighty God for His blessings and guidance so that we can gather here to attend today's event. My name is Muhammad Sharafi Hatta from the Research and Analysis Division of FPCI Chapter UI Board of 2021, and I will be acting as the Master of Ceremony of today's event. Before we start our event, I would like to remind all of our participants to please rename your Zoom display name with the format of name-institution, and please keep your microphone off during the event. However, you're expected to turn on your camera in order to respect our speakers. Next, we would like to welcome and express our gratitude to the Board of Executives, Tasha Asila Ramadina as the President, Istiafa Diati as Vice President of Human Resources and Substance, and Marfila Failician as Vice President of Public Relations and Affairs of FPCI Chapter UI Board of 2021. We would also like to welcome our speakers, moderators, and all of the participants of FPCI Chapter UI World in a Snap webinar, analyzing the China-India border dispute developments and consequences. In today's event, we are pleased to have Mr. Salvatore Babuns, Associate Professor at the University of Sydney and an online columnist for Foreign Policy magazine, Dr. Amrita Jash, a Research Fellow at the Center for Land Warfare Studies, and Mr. Argung Nurwijoyo, a lecturer at the Faculty of Social and Political Sciences, Universitas Indonesia, as the speakers of today's webinar, who will be delivering many insights and knowledge regarding the China-India border dispute. We are also pleased to have Mr. Aristio Rizka Darmawan, a lecturer at the Faculty of Law, Universitas Indonesia, who will be the moderator for today's webinar. FPCI Chapter UI World in a Snap, or WINS, is an infographic designed by the Research and Analysis Division of FPCI Chapter UI. This infographic contains a brief summary on recent foreign policy and international relations issues, which are posted on our social media page in Instagram at @FPCIUE. Due to the success of the previous editions of WINS webinar and the high interest on foreign policy studies among our audience, FPCI Chapter UI decides to hold a World in a Snap webinar, which is open for students, academicians, researchers, and the general public who are interested in foreign policy. I will remind the participant to be actively involved in the discussion as well as raise your questions because at the end of the session, there will be a nomination for Best Participant. We highly encourage you to raise your questions to the speakers because we will be judging the Best Participant candidate based on the most relevant and interesting questions. So please do not hesitate to raise your question and be actively involved in the discussion. Before we start the main session, let me explain today's rundown. Will be opened by an opening from the Master of Ceremony, a remarks from the Project Officer and President of FPCI Chapter UI Board of 2021, a profile introductions of the moderator, a profile introductions of the speakers by the moderator, a presentation by Mr. Salvatore Babunes, a presentation by Dr. Amrita Jash, a presentation by Mr. Argung Nurwijoyo, a questions and answer session, some concluding remarks from our moderator, Best Participant announcements and photo sessions, and a closing from the Master of Ceremony. Without further ado, please welcome Kenzi Rifantia as Project Officer of this event, who will be delivering his opening remarks. For Kenzi, the time and place is yours.
Thank you very much, Master of Ceremony. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope we are all in our best of health today. It is a great honor for me to be given the opportunity to hold today's World in a Snap webinar, analyzing the China-India border dispute, developments, and consequences. Firstly, I would like to welcome and thank all of our wonderful participants here today for attending and your willingness to learn. I would also like to welcome our speakers, Mr. Salvatore Babunis, Mr. Agung Nurwijoyo, and Dr. Amrita Jash. Thank you for your willingness to share your knowledge and expertise with all of us today. Last but not least, I would like to welcome and thank Mr. Aristio Rizka Darmawan, who will be the moderator for our discussion. Next, my most sincere gratitude goes to Kak Tasil, Kak Tia, and Kak Vela as the Board of Executives of FPCI Chapter UI Board of 2021, as well as Kak Evelyn, Kak Diva, and Kak Joseph as the Manager and Vice Managers of the Research and Analysis Division for all your guidance and support. In these dire times, we tend to focus all of our thoughts, efforts, and energy into one thing and one thing only, the COVID-19 pandemic. It is reasonable and logical, of course, given that this global pandemic has unfortunately reshaped our entire lives in ways that we did not expect. However, it is also turning our attention away from the significant events that are unfolding around us, one of them being the ongoing border dispute between China and India. Now, why should we, who are sitting probably thousands of kilometers away from the Himalayan mountains, pay attention to this particular issue? Well, we all know that both China and India are emerging giants on the global stage. Especially in recent years, China's political influence and economic growth has staggered the world, very quickly catching up to that of the United States. China and India have been caught up in this dispute for many decades, but unfortunately, it has yet to be completely resolved. This topic is often considered a high-level discussion among academicians and students due to its complicated and controversial nature. However, I believe that it is just as important for all of us to learn more about it. I hope through today's webinar, we can get the big picture, we can comprehend how this dispute came to be, and we can understand various perspectives on it. All in all, I highly hope that all of us can enjoy this webinar and gain more insights to build up our knowledge on this issue. Thank you very much, everyone. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia, Chapter Universitas Indonesia, Thrive with Intelligence.
Thank you, Kenzie, for your opening remarks. Next, we are inviting Tasha Asila Ramadina as the President of FPCI Chapter UI Board of 2021, who will be delivering her opening remarks. For Tasha Asila, the time and place is yours.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Shalom, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya. Good afternoon, everyone. Once again, welcome to FPCI Chapter Wins webinar. I would like to say thank you to our speakers, Mr. Salvatore Babones, Dr. Amrita Jas, Mas Ageng Nirwijoyo, and our moderator, Bang Aristio. I know it's weekend, and you're supposed to spend your weekend with your family or friends, but thank you for attending our webinar. It's such an honor for us to have you in our event. For all the participants, thank you for choosing our webinar among those webinars out there. I know there are a lot of webinars in this Saturday, but thank you for choosing our event. Talking about China and India as two countries with biggest population always make me wondering what are their plans and what are their actions towards several issues. I'm feeling so excited to gain another perspective from our speakers today, and I'm also pretty sure that all participants in here want to know the same thing. Too often we overcome with confuse, frustration, anger, and sadness as we read the headline on several conflicts that happen in the world. Also, I know during this pandemic, we even survived to live and stay happy with our family and friends. But we are in this together. No matter how hard the situation is, we have to be ready for the new beginning and make a better world for our future. As Indonesian, we should not close our eyes and ears about what's happening in other countries, because the relations between China and India will give a huge impact for Indonesia. Maybe today we are in here as a student, but within 5 until 10 years, some of us will become the decision maker. And it's important for us to learn from now. As what's happening today will become the history in the future, and we need to learn from the past. This world would be better if we start caring and helping each other. There is one quote that I really like: strength doesn't come from physical capacity, it comes from inimitable will, by Mahatma Gandhi. Well, I hope this discussion will give many benefits for us. Enjoy your weekend with us. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Shalom, Om Shanti Shanti Om, FPCI Chapter E, Thrive with Intelligence.
Thank you, Tasha Asila, for your opening remarks. Next, I would like to introduce our moderator for today's event. Our discussion today will be moderated by Mr. Aristio Rizka Darmawan, a lecturer on international law at the Faculty of Law, Universitas Indonesia. Mr. Aristio himself is an alumnus of the Faculty of Law at Universitas Indonesia, where he received his bachelor's degree in 2017. He also attended the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University in the United States, and he received his master's degree in international law in 2019. Mr. Aristio is currently a co-director and researcher at the Center for Sustainable Ocean Policy. Besides that, he is also a researcher at the Center for International Law Studies. His most recent articles and publications surround the topics of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, and the South China Sea situation and Indonesian foreign policy in that context. Without further ado, please give a warm welcome for Mr. Aristio Rizka Darmawan.
Thank you very much, Mr. MC, for the very kind introductions. And my name is Aristio Darmawan. I'm a lecturer in international law at the Universitas Indonesia, and it gives me a great pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar on the India and China border dispute, development, and consequences. As we might know that in the last several years, there has been a lot of analysis and scholarly articles that predict that the 21st century is going to be the Asian centuries. Because the economic growth and security attention of the world is shifting to Asia rather than to the Western European countries. And the Asian centuries, at the heart of these Asian centuries was actually driven by the China and India as the two largest economy in Asia. And therefore, India and China relationships is very much important, not only for the regions, but for the whole of the world as well. And as we might know, that border dispute is one of the most complicated issues of our times. There has been a lot of borders dispute all over the world. And I'm delighted that today we will discuss a very important and timely topics on the China and India border dispute in the Himalayas. And I'm really glad that we already have three very distinguished speakers. So the first speaker that will give his keynote speaker is Professor Salvatore Babuns, who is a associate professor at the University of Sydney, and online columnist for the Foreign Policy magazine. Professor Babuns received his master's degrees and PhDs in sociology from the Johns Hopkins University in the United States. He's also currently an elected member of the nonprofit National Committee on the U.S.-China Relations Organizations. His academic research takes a long-term approach to interpreting the structure of the global economy with particular focus on the Indo-Pacific integrations. So Professor Salvatore will be giving his keynote speech for more or less 10 minutes, and then will be followed up by a Q&A and a small discussions for around 20 minutes. So without any further ado, Professor Babuns, all the time is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you everyone for attending. It's very flattering, and I do appreciate your time and attention this weekend. I've been asked to speak about why China and India fought in June 2020 in the high Himalayas in Ladakh. But let me start the answer in Indonesia, in Bandung, in 1955. Of course, all of you are probably aware of the Bandung Conference that brought together Sukarno as host, Jawaharlal Nehru of India as one of the co-sponsors, Zhou Enlai of China, the premier of China at the time, as a participant, and of course, dozens of countries from across Africa and Asia. The Bandung principles, the 10 principles that were agreed at the conference, I'm not going to read all of them, but they included principles like respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity of all nations, refraining from acts or threats of aggression or the use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any nation, settlement of all international disputes by peaceful means, such as negotiation, conciliation, arbitration, or judicial settlement, and promotion of mutual interests and cooperation. Now, I'm actually reading those 10 principles of Bandung, or reading a few of them, from the website of the China Daily. So these are principles that continue to be endorsed, at least in theory, by the Chinese government. And they're very key to China-India relations because they build on an agreement just 1 year previous. So in 1954, China and India had agreed the Panchdil Agreement. And again, similar principles: mutual respect for each other's territorial integrity and sovereignty, mutual non-aggression, mutual non-interference, equality, peaceful coexistence. These are principles that stand at the core of Chinese international relations doctrine. Thus, in 1962, when China launched a surprise attack along the China-India border, all across the border with India, both in the east and in the west. Of course, India and China have two separate borders, separated by Nepal in the middle. It broke Nehru's heart. Nehru was completely aghast, taken by surprise. He had no idea that an attack was coming. He truly believed in the Bandung principles and the Panchdil principles and the unity of the non-aligned movement. And that unity lasted only 7 years before the largest non-aligned country was attacking the second largest non-aligned country in what I think we must remember was entirely a surprise attack out of nowhere. There was no indication that an attack was coming. Now, China, I should say modern China, the PRC China, communist China, is, well, let's say prone to surprise attacks. This was not the first. In fact, the Chinese intervention in Korea in 1950 was a similar mass surprise attack with no prior announcement of millions of soldiers being sent across the Korean frontier to battle United Nations troops, which were led by the United States and South Korea. In 1979, China launched a surprise attack across the border with Vietnam, which was repulsed in a big surprise for China. China's also been supporting separatist rebels in northern Myanmar. So I think a lot of people who view the Myanmar coup that's happening this year as China orchestrated need to think again, because really China has been the thorn in the side of the Chinese military, not the ally of the Chinese military all these years. Of course, the South China Sea disputes are completely at odds with the Bandung principles. And I might mention last year's Natuna Islands incursion in Indonesia. So it's not just India or Vietnam that China has quarrel with, it's all of its neighbors. So the attack on India in June 2020, maybe in that context, doesn't come as so much of a surprise, at least not a surprise that it was unannounced or that it was in peacetime, or that at the time China and India were negotiating deeper commercial relations. But what caused it? I mean, I'm not a sinologist. I don't speak Chinese. I study the region and its relationships. I don't study China specifically. I do, however, talk to sinologists and try to get their own views of the matter. The top sinologists I've talked to seem pretty much agreed that this was not an attack ordered by Xi Jinping. It was a local initiative, but a local initiative in line with messages that came from the top. So China's governance, when we see it from outside, we often think of it as a top-down behemoth, that a single head, Xi Jinping, commands everything that's going on in China. In reality, the center wants to be able to take credit for things that go right and to declaim any responsibility for things that go wrong. So there's much more governance by general principles, almost like an old-fashioned ancient world satrapy model of governance, where a local governor, a local satrap, is responsible for making local decisions that will either be endorsed or disowned by the central leadership. Now, of course, in the 21st century, we don't need that kind of governance. We all have mobile phones. Yet China continues to operate in that way. Now, China's general stance in the Xi Jinping era has been one of extreme, provocative hostility. Not war. China's not invading other countries, but of extreme provocation. The latest has been China's new Coast Guard law, which empowers China's Coast Guard to fire on civilian ships of other countries in other countries' legal waters, as long as they're waters that China also claims. Well, that's wildly inconsistent with Bandung principles, but it is entirely consistent with China's pattern of action over the last 70 years. It's only become more extreme, more public, more forward and thrusting under Xi Jinping. So I suspect what happened in Ladakh in June 2020 was not that a local commander was told, please try to kill 24 Indian troops. I think that's extremely unlikely. But was the local commander understanding orders to constantly press China's claims as strongly and forcefully as possible? Yes, I think that's very likely. And when you're constantly pressing on all points in your frontier, everywhere from Ladakh in the far west of India to the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands between the East China Sea between China and Japan, if you're pressing along that entire arc that I like to call the Indo-Pacific arc at the same time, well, problems are going to break out at random at various points along the arc wherever things have pushed too far, or more likely, whenever your opponents start to push back. And I suspect that's what really happened in Ladakh, was not that China changed its policy and decided to invade India, but rather that a local Indian commander just wouldn't stand aside. And when that local Indian commander refused to stand aside, he was pushed off a mountain. And that started a melee that resulted in the loss of 24 lives. I'll leave it there. I'm happy to take questions, and I'm especially interested to hear your own views, since this is not particularly an India-China problem. It's also an Indonesia-China problem, a Philippines-China problem, a Japan-China problem. This is something that everyone in the region has to deal with, including us here in Australia.
Thank you very much, Professor Baboons, for your very, very interesting presentations. I'm really glad that you actually mentioning the importance or the principles, how relevant is the Bandung principles here in the situations that facing the border today. So, and I also, it's a lot of interesting point that you mentioned, but from my point of view, I think, yeah, indeed, that is the current situation is also because of the China's some sort of an aggressive role and important role in the world stage. Because if we observed, I think is actually China is not only have a border dispute with India, right? China have a lot of have a significant dispute in the South China Sea with China, ASEAN neighbor. China also have a Senkaku Island dispute with Korea and Japanese neighbor. So I think it's very much China problem, I think, with their neighboring countries. So I do have several questions here, just to dig more further from your opinion about the issues. So the first, I think I would like to draw your attention a bit to what happened today. Right. So considering the dispute is getting more escalated, what do you think that will be the implications of the dispute, especially with the investment and the economic cooperations with the Asian regions? Do you think will it implicate not only between India and China, but also spill over to the Asian neighboring state as well, Professor?
The cost for China of these disputes has been very high. And we can see that in India, where China was on the way to capturing not only the Indian smartphone market, but even the Indian app market. And now we see Chinese smartphones in India have to be rebranded because nobody will buy them if they have a Chinese brand, and all of the apps have been banned by the Indian government. I think more than 300 apps have been banned by the Indian government. And that's not just little toys. That's things like Alibaba trying to run an e-commerce site in India has now been banned in India. And I think the takeaway from that is China's leadership, and Xi Jinping in particular, have decided that moderately prosperous is good enough. That is, China has reached a level of middle income. The leadership of China is relatively well off. They don't face any real economic challenges. And at this point, they're willing to sacrifice the potential for economic development, developing new markets, expanding overseas. They're willing to sacrifice that potential in return for meeting their geostrategic and security goals. And that's why we see what seems to be a higher level of activity all across the border. It's that China is not making those rational economic calculations that, is it really worth offending a market of 1.4 billion people in order to grab a few square kilometers of wasteland in the high Himalayas.
All right, thank you very much. So I think it's also very interesting for us to see whether or not there's a possible third-party involvement in the dispute, specifically between China and India. Do you think, is there any third parties that is involved in the conflict? And if so, if there are any, what kind of involvement it will take and what will be the impact of the involvement of the third party in the dispute?
The United States seems to want to be a third party, and I think India is rightly wary about allowing it to become one. I don't think that an American involvement in these disputes would really would benefit India, and I don't think India recognizes any need for American assistance in its disputes with China. The other third party, of course, is Pakistan, and Pakistan's military leadership seems to have decided that it would rather stay out of this conflict. So China and Pakistan are long-term allies, and they've become closer. The common description from the Chinese side is like lips and teeth. They're that close, China and Pakistan. But Pakistan has been notably absent from this dispute in Ladakh, despite the fact that despite the fact that the India-Pakistan border disputes in Gilgit-Baltistan are right there on the Siachen Glacier, not very far away.
Yeah, that's the Pakistan is very quite an interesting point that you make. So you don't think that China would use Pakistan to pressure China on these issues? You don't think that would be?
It would be the strategic thing to do. I don't know what China actually is doing, but Pakistan has been remarkably quiet. And in fact, in the last few months, we've seen the peace overtures between Pakistan and India. So Pakistan certainly did not take the opportunity of the China-India conflict to advance along its glacier frontiers with India. And now perhaps we're seeing the reward for that India is now talking about potentially helping the Pakistan economy.
Right, so that's very interesting. So another interesting point, I think, in regards to the involvement of the third party is the position of Russia. As we might know that Russia is pretty good relationships with both China and India in this regard. So do you think Russia can play a strategic role, so to speak, in mediating the conflict? You mentioned earlier that the United States is also a possible third-party involvement, but what about Russia? Do you think Russia can become the suitable third party to help them in mediating the dispute?
Well, if you use the word mediation, I think if there were going to be a mediator, it would be Russia. But India will not seek mediation, and China will not seek mediation. That is, mediation is very much out of consideration in both countries' foreign policy doctrines. Now, that's not to say it can't happen. I'm just saying it would contradict decades of history for either country to be willing to accept mediation of this dispute. Both countries have long maintained that they do not accept mediation of their border disputes. That said, Russia has a very long-term, going back to the Soviet Union, a strong 60-year strategic partnership with India. Its relationship with China is much more guarded, much more transactional. It's very recent, the rapprochement between China and Russia, and it's purely driven by the feeling of having a common enemy in the United States. That is, there's no, I think, real sense of collaboration between Russia and China. So I think Russia would be seen to be on India's side, so to speak, if push careful not to let push come to shove and not to get involved in this dispute. But it certainly would not be considered an even broker between the two. The relationship between Russia and India is dramatically deeper than the relationship between Russia and China.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting. So if we talk about the other states' involvement in the dispute and the strategic geopolitical situations in the Indo-Pacific, so there's an emerging alliance, so to speak, that is a Quad. I hope I think you're very familiar with the Quad cooperation.
Right.
How do you think that the involvement of Quad? Will you think that India use Quad in order to press China, or like, what's your take on that?
India certainly will not use the Quad to press China. The Quad is not really an Indian-led mechanism. India has been reluctant but willing to join a Quad grouping. To the extent that it's in the Quad, its involvement, I think, is purely maritime. That is, the Quad being United States, Japan, Australia, India, is really an Indo-Pacific maritime grouping, not an Eurasian terrestrial grouping. So it really has very little to do with this dispute. That said, Joe Biden doesn't even seem to want the Quad to have a security focus at all. He has tried to reinvigorate the Quad Forum, but to use it for his own domestic political purposes. That is, his top two purposes for the Quad are coronavirus and climate change. And coronavirus and climate change may be important issues, but they're not going to push back against China's territorial expansionism.
All right, thank you very much. So we've already talked quite a bit about the involvement of third parties as well as the geopolitical situations in regions. But let us go back again to the central issues of the border dispute between India and Pakistan. What do you think is the central issues? Why do China and India really head to head, or regarded the border as very important? Because if you talk about the South China Sea, we all know that there's a lot of wealth in the South China Sea in terms of the fisheries resources, oil and gas, strategic passage in the South China Sea. So and therefore that is quite makes sense that South China Sea is a really hot spot for geopolitical and geopolitical rivalry. What do you think the central issues here in the border dispute between India and China? Why do you think that both countries really urge to have a control on the border area?
This area is unimaginably remote. To put it into context, between the Chinese provinces or special administrative regions of Tibet and Xinjiang, the two Western Chinese regions, there is a single two-lane road connecting the two. That's it. One two-lane road and nothing else. Otherwise, you have to walk over the mountain passes to get between Xinjiang and Tibet. There is one road connecting Xinjiang to Pakistan. And both of those roads travel through what nominally, at least until 1962, would have been considered Indian territory. Which is to say, if you ask an Indian to list the countries that India borders, the Indian would say, oh, well, Pakistan, China, Afghanistan. And as a non-Indian, you might say, wait a minute, how does India border Afghanistan? And the answer is that just immediately following the partition of India in 1947, the state of Jammu and Kashmir, which was ruled by, was a quote unquote princely state, that is, it was nominally independent under a Raja. Jammu and Kashmir opted to join India, but immediately Pakistan invaded the country. And as a result, there was the 1947-48 war over Kashmir between India and Pakistan. Pakistan ended up occupying the area, a small area of Kashmir itself, but also the large area called Gilgit-Baltistan, which is if you're looking at a map of India has India's legal borders, the claimed borders, there'll be a bulge in the upper left, and that bulge is Gilgit-Baltistan, and it would connect India to Afghanistan. Now, Pakistan had not only seized Gilgit-Baltistan with British help, it must be said, in 1948, but then signed over a part of it to China. So part of China occupied India from an Indian perspective, is in Ladakh and in what the rest of the world thinks of as India. Part of it is in what the rest of the world sees as Pakistan-occupied Kashmir or part of Pakistan. So there are two, like I said, just two roads connecting Xinjiang to the south, one to Tibet, one to Pakistan, and they both run through what would have been India had the 1962 war never occurred.
All right, that's very very interesting fact, I think. So let's talk a little bit about what has been done in the dispute. What do you think has been done by the China and India government to resolve the dispute peacefully? Is there anything important notes that you have here?
Well, there has been an agreement now on a pullback, and the pullback was simultaneous and monitored. The big thing was they pulled back their heavy units, so the armored units that had gotten involved. There is a small area of high plateau that in Ladakh that the countries had actually moved armored vehicles onto. But the big give up for India was giving up a mountain peak that it had occupied through the winter. It was actually occupied, again, to show how complicated this whole situation is. It was occupied by India's Special Frontier Force, who are very hardy mountaineers. And this position overlooked the Chinese positions. This was ultimately what turned China's flank, so to speak. And the Special Frontier Force is made up of members of the Tibetan exile community in India. Because, of course, when China occupied Tibet in 1950, many Tibetans fled. Then, of course, the Dalai Lama later fled from China to India, I'm going to forget the name of the town, Darjeeling. No, sorry, I'm going to forget the name of the town in northern India. And these troops, the Special Frontier Force, are recruited from among the Tibetan exile community. So the people who turned China's flank in the Ladakh conflict were actually Tibetans. And that's how complicated all of this situation really is.
So that has been agreement for in that particular border.
Oh yes, I'm sorry.
So
Yes.
Is it? Do you?
Yes,
think,
there has been a pullback agreement.
Yeah. So do you think will that be again a third party's settlement of dispute mechanisms? For example, will they both go to the International Court of Justice in order to settle the border dispute, or is it very impossible?
No, it's I think inconceivable, but look, inconceivable things have happened, and so I won't say it's impossible. I'll say it's inconceivable in the sense that I just can't imagine it would happen. And sorry, we're getting a lot of feedback from your speaker. It's just inconceivable that it would happen because both countries have a very firm foreign policy doctrine of not turning to mediation. Both of them consider this their sovereign territory. It's not a matter of a disputed border. It's a matter that China's claimed border is miles within India, and India's claimed border is miles within China. But no, I don't think there's any prospect of a United Nations or other third-party intervention. There won't be any international observers on this border. And I say that with confidence that, look, there haven't been international observers in the Pakistan-China conflict, Pakistan-India conflict. There haven't been international observers in India's past border disputes with China. I see no reason why this dispute would ultimately be resolved with international observers.
All right, thank you very much for that. So if one day either China or India are forced to abandon their current positions on the dispute, what are the consequences for them, do you think?
The consequences would be mainly internal and political. These areas have, when you talk to strategic scholars, you will hear every area of the world spoken of as this is a highly strategic zone. But there's almost nowhere in the world that's more remote than these parts of the Himalayas. So if it's the last place in the world that is actually strategic. And in fact, that's why it's being fought over. China has, in recent years, in the Xi Jinping years, really pushed in areas that don't involve civilian populations. Areas like the South China Sea, the East China Sea, the Himalayas, because China is not really interested in conquering people to rule over. This is really all about just a constant push to promote nationalism, promote China's prestige as they see it in the world and with their own population. Look, Indian analysts have told me that this area is very strategic for specific reasons, that if this certain ridge falls, then China will be able to move on the city of Leh. But you have to ask, why would China want to conquer the city of Leh? I mean, on the other side of the border, on the eastern side of the border, China had occupied most of Arunachal Pradesh, and then it withdrew in 1962. It didn't withdraw because it was afraid of a counterattack. It withdrew because it didn't want to have to govern Arunachal Pradesh.
All right, thank you very much. That is a very interesting point. So I only have one last questions from Professor Babones. How do you think that this dispute will continue to develop in the near future?
I think it'll develop. Disputes along these borders have developed. Sorry, we need to silence you because the sound isolation. Thank you. Sorry, I don't mean to silence you. It's just a technical matter. I think this will develop very much like the other disputes have developed. That is, it'll quiet down. It'll eventually become frozen. The local commanders will have protocols in place to prevent conflict. And then in 2 or 3 or 5 years, there will be another flare-up in another part of the border because nothing structural has changed. China still has a very aggressive forward posture all along the border. And until that changes, there will be more disputes. It's just like Natuna in Indonesia. A dispute's going to happen every 2, 3, 5 years until China stops being so aggressive. That's really the only way the disputes will stop.
And I think we all learn a lot from your presentations as well as our discussions. So please join me to thank you, Professor Babon, for your remarkable insight. Thank you, Professor. In New Delhi, she's a recipient of the prestigious private scholarships at the University of Cambridge. Dr. Josh holds a PhD in Chinese studies from Jawaharlal Nehru University, Department of Politics and International Studies at the University of
I'm very sorry, Mr. Aristio. Excuse me.
Okay.
Seems like your internet connection has been dropping recently.
So can you hear me now? Is it working?
Yes, we can hear you, Aristio.
Okay. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay. So Dr. Josh has been a visiting fellow at the Department of Politics and International Studies at the University of Cambridge.
Yes,
UCG.
Mr. Aristio, we can hear you clear. Thank you.
Okay. Dr. Josh is a researcher under the Harvard Yanqing program. A researcher under the China Ministry of Commerce in 2014 and India-China Initiative Fellow at the Johns Hopkins University. He has authored the book of commerce in 2014, and U.S. China, India, China, India. Okay, so and she wrote extensively in the issues of uh, China military strategy. So without any further ado, please welcome Dr. Armita Jati.
I hope I'm audible. I would like to have a heads up. No, I think so. The voice is cracking from the other end. Firstly, can I get a heads up?
So yeah, we can hear you, Dr. Armita.
Okay.
You can start now.
Sure. Firstly, I would like to extend gratitude to FPCI Chapter, University of Indonesia, for inviting me to speak on a subject which is not just any more limited to India and China, but has taken extended pastures interest and the implications that it hold for the world at large now, and Asia in it was listen to Professor Babuns, who gave a broader perspective, argue from an Indian perspective. That's the forte that I bring in today. Can I have the first slide, please? Can you change the slide, please?
I think we have quite a small technical problem.
Okay.
Yeah. I think the signal is not quite well, so this is the weakness of Zoom, I think.
In behalf of the committee, I would apologize. It seems to be have a bit of a technical difficulties according to the Zoom connections.
Okay. So coming to the context, we see that in the last year, it was not just the pandemic that made the headlines, but what created far more interest and attention was the India-China crisis in eastern Ladakh, which was not expected, because when the world came to a grinding halt, and you see two countries engaged in lockdowns in a terrain in almost a no man's land. I would start by quoting John Garver, because just after 1962 war, Garver, in his assessment, he said that the India-China border has become a protracted contest between the two countries. And since then, we see that the protracted nature has just got further protracted, because we are still dealing with the dispute, and it has only become far more emboldened, though we say that it was the border with the much relative peace. However, 2020 dynamics changed the entire ball game altogether. And therefore, more precisely, the Gardwan Valley incident, which led to casualties, which was almost after 45 years of that such a big casualty took place after the Tulumla incident of 1975. And that was appalling. The second characteristic was it was the longest standoff after Samdurunchu of 1986 to 87. here I would like to note that it was 1962, after 1962, the ties between India and China got frozen. And it was only in 1988 with Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi's visit to China that, again, the relations came to the track and the next chapter started in India-China relations. However, unlike past standards, we had Doklam in 2017, but the difference in 2020 was the breach of protocols, because the very casualties is witnessed in terms of all the agreements or the CBMs that exist. They have been proved nullified. We have 5 agreements: 1993, 1996, 2005, 2012, and 2013. Because each of these agreements, precisely more in 1996 agreement, it said that no firearms, but we see the casualties, therefore proves that the weapons used by China, which is like clubs, that's very parochial, and you can't even think of, not even fire, but going back to a Stone Age kind of scenario existing in Galwan Valley. So every dynamic, that the way it unfolded, it actually gave enough surprises, or rather caught you by surprise, that is this the 21st century warfare, where we are talking about information warfare? We are talking of drones, we are talking of supersonics and hypersonics, but what happened in Galwan was completely going back to a Paleolithic age. Therefore, the fears of conflict between the two nuclear-armed neighbors are dominant now, which was earlier, that we breathed some kind of understanding that, and we used to gloat that no single fire has been shot, but everything has come full circle, that, now there is an increasing threat. However, we have engaged into disengagement, and we have completed phase 1 of disengagement in this month. After holding 10 rounds of military level talks, we had the 21st Working Mechanism Group talk in March 2021, and our special representatives talks are still pending, and as well as the leadership meeting. So what happens in the upcoming BRICS event, a lot will unfold after that. So therefore, the question, can the border be settled? Now the curiosity is much more, rather the dilemma is much deeper. Next slide, please. Therefore, the border. What is the border? The border is of about 3,488 kilometers, which runs from northwest of Karakoram Pass and ends at Arunachal Pradesh. So that is the exterior line that exists. Now, there is no international agreement or accepted boundary that exists. And therefore, neither an agreement or where does this de facto line of actual control exist between India and China. Therefore, as the border is neither delineated on the map or demarcated on the ground, it brings in that, the huge perception gap, because then you don't know where the borders lie. So patrolling, cross-patrolling, it depends on your perception of the border that then creates the, crisis situations or acts of transgressions that come into place. And then gradually, how we see today, are taking bigger forms in terms of military standoffs. Next slide, please. Therefore, here I try to bring in the dispute, as I've annotated on the map. The dispute extends over 3 sectors, that is the Western, the Middle, and the Eastern sector. The Western sector is where the Eastern Ladakh crisis happened. Middle sector, which we see as comparatively, less stressful or less tense. However, in 2020, even the middle sector has been, the tension are cropping up, especially there was a Nakula incident and also in Eastern sector with the Nakula incident in Sikkim. And of course, Arunachal Pradesh, which remains under talks, and even with a prime minister's visit or leader's visit or Dalai Lama's visit to Arunachal Pradesh creates a lot of discord or contributes to the discord between India and China. So this is what brings in the geographical distribution of how the LSC or how the dispute plays out and why the terrain is important. As the moderator asked that, why is it so important? So why? Because the territory, and if I have to argue from why does Arunachal Pradesh is important for China? Because there is a place that is Tawang, where the fourth Dalai Lama was born, and that becomes a card that China can use to appease its own Tibetan population. So there is a lot of strategic thought in place, and I'll come back to why Aksai Chin is important or why things are cropping up in the Western sector. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Therefore, what calls for the dispute? There are two aspects to it. Which is driven by a perception gap, the divergence over the McMahon line between India and China, and secondly, the dilemma over the LSE. As you know, McMahon line is driven from the 1914 Shimla Agreement, which was between then British India, the Tibetan government, and the Chinese government. So this is the context. And of course, the dilemma over the LSE is grounded of neither being delineated on the map or demarcated on the ground. So keeping this perspective, I'll throw light on how it comes into play, which is in my next slide. Yes. So therefore, we see a discrepancy in the Chinese attitude because China, Beijing rejects the McMahon line on the grounds of calling it, an imperialist legacy. And because China rejects that, how could British India sign it? Or it doesn't even consider that Tibet was not even sovereign. So why should one take that accord seriously? But why I call it a discrepancy is because China accepts the same McMahon line when it deals with Burma. They have settled the dispute based on this very McMahon line in 1960. And the other aspect is that of watershed principle, which China practices with Nepal, but doesn't do it with India. And this watershed principle has again helped China, or based on it, China has settled its border dispute with Nepal, dividing the Mount Everest based on this principle. However, in terms of India, neither of these principles are put into place by China. So this brings in that, the asymmetry in Chinese behavior, that why only towards India, and also shows that when it comes to the India-China border, a concession from China or conciliatory attitude from China is highly problematic. Therefore, what it goes back to or wraps its case on is that of the 1959 LSE. That is, Beijing's position is China-India border. LSE is very clear, that is LSE on November 7th, 1959. And there is a context of why Beijing reiterates this line. Next slide, please. And the context is provided by Premier Chow En Lai's letter to Jawaharlal Nehru on 7th November 1959. As I have highlighted the quoted text, and I would like to quote or reiterate that Chow in his letter wrote, in order to maintain effectively the status quo of the border between the two countries, to ensure the tranquility of the border regions, and to create a favorable atmosphere for a friendly settlement of the boundary question, the Chinese government proposes that the armed forces of China and India each withdraw 20 kilometers at once from the so-called McMahon line in the east and from the line up to which each side exercises actual control in the west, and that the two sides undertake to refrain from again sending their armed personnel to be stationed in and patrol the zones from which they have evacuated their armed forces, but still maintain civil administrative personnel and unarmed police there for the performance of administrative duties and maintenance of order. So this has been the Chinese position, and we saw that it came into a lot of attention last year because the Global Times or in the Indian newspapers, these quotations were constantly highlighted in the text, that where is this perception building from? Because China reiterates that, we go back to the 1959 LSE. So this is what it means. Next slide, please. Howsoever, what has been India's stand? India has rejected China's stand, and India's official position suggests, therefore, it has never accepted the so-called unilaterally defined 59 LSE of the 1959 LSE, because Nehru then returned a reply to Chow and Lai stating, as I quote, that a proper understanding of the facts in regard to the Sino-Indian boundary is essential to the consideration of any proposal that is made for the avoidance of border clashes. So India has consistently rejected China's claims, and that has been the position. And this very factor, therefore, leads to this perception gap. And therefore, we see that there are so many issues that, why this LSE becomes a constant point of discord. It's the very perception that where does the dividing line start or end becomes the point of contradiction between the two countries. But increasingly, we see that, the Chinese behavior is to push the envelope, to push the territorial claims further and further, therefore highlighting more of a Chinese expansionist design. Also now said that, a kind of salami slicing tactic that China is adopting in its land border. We have seen that being executed in South China Sea, but we see that in terms of a land border, which is of course evitable only in terms of India. We see that approach is coming. First, we saw it in Doklam, and now we see it in terms of the Eastern Ladakh crisis in 2020. Next slide, please. And therefore, we see the major standoffs. If you see, it's 62, the Sino-Indian border war. 67 was Natula and Chola skirmishes. 75 is the Tolongla incident that led to casualties. 86 and 87, the longest standing standoff in Samderungchu. 2013, now after 87, we see a direct jump into 2013. That was in Daulat Beg Oldi and Chumar standoff. 2014 was Demchok. 2015 was Birthse. 2017 was Doklam, and 2020 Eastern Ladakh. After 87, we see a kind of continuity in Chinese behavior. So therefore, there is an expansionist design that, what China is trying to do or exercise along the more so, under Xi Jinping, we see from 2013, the push is very much verified that, how they are pushing every inch of their claims to reassert their claims or solidify their claims. Next slide, please. And here is the case of Chinese transgressions. I take from 2013 because that's where we see the jump after 87. And with the DBO Chumar standoff, you can see the trend. And I could just get the figures just before the Eastern Ladakh crisis, already it was, amidst the pandemic, we see an increasing trend in Eastern Ladakh with 170, already 130 in Ladakh. So majority, almost 90% in Ladakh happening as on May 2020. So these are all available in open domain, and which highlights that, the Chinese behavioral trend, which is getting aggressive, assertive, and, far more pronounced in its actions. Next slide, please. And therefore, we come to China's adventurism in Eastern Ladakh. Why Eastern Ladakh? It's because and that to Aksai-Chin, Beijing's anxiety over Aksai-Chin. Two factors are very dominant when you see from India's point of view, is that India's infrastructure buildup in this area, especially the Darbuk-Shok Daulat-Begoldi Road, which has created a lot of anxiety in the Chinese minds. And why so? Because it is in close proximity to that of China's own Western High Express Highway, or G219, which is directly connected to Aksai-Chin, and also to that of makes inroads into the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor and the other feeder roads. So there is a critical concern from China that, India is that proximate, India has inched that proximal to its own concern. So there is a Chinese anxiety that is growing in. And secondly, India's declaration of Ladakh as a union territory in 2019 on 5th August, the state of Jammu and Kashmir was divided into two union territories, separating that of Jammu and Kashmir as a separate UT and Ladakh itself as a separate UT. And of course, it concerns Beijing because in Beijing's view, Ladakh is part of Chinese territory in the western section of the China-India boundary. So all these factors, they have played out, because at the end of the day, it is not that China's rise makes it all powerful. It has also made China insecure, because the opponents are equally now have become greater challengers. And we have seen that in case of the border dispute with India, China has faced the maximum resistance. In South China Sea, its island build-up activities didn't face that resistance. Or in East China Sea, building of the ADIZ. However, China's inroads into LSC or along the Himalayan border with India faced successive resistance. They came in and they faced a resistance. First was Doklam, second was Eastern Ladakh. So there is a growing insecurity in Chinese mind when it comes to India. So India too is now seen as a potential threat by China. So it is not just the United States or Japan, but India in this region. And when you talk of Asian century, therefore, the question comes, can one mountain have two tigers, which is itself a Chinese proverb? And is there enough space to accommodate the rise of both the countries? Therefore, these are very tough questions to answer, because the aspirations are there. However, the way of growth or becoming the perception of the world order is very distinct in these two countries, which therefore contributes to the larger dimension of the problem. Next slide, please. Therefore, the implications when we see on the larger discourse, India-China border, from being a long-standing, peaceful border, not much attention to, has emerged as a regional hotspot. So therefore, no oversight can be given. Anything happens in India-China, a slightest even will have deeper repercussions for Asia, particularly the Asian region, and the world at large. So there remains no doubt to the fact that, how it will be played out. Secondly, border settlement is not an easy task. So far, the dilemma was border resolution, but now we see the very border management is becoming a point of contention or, troublesome. And each time we are seeing new differences are getting added to the old dispute. So that's where, the critical point lies. Thirdly, the distrust, which came into being from 1962, has only gone deeper. And with Doklam, with Eastern Ladakh, it is far more, the divide is much bigger. And therefore, of course, the perception will obviously be compounded with greater misperceptions when you try to weigh in the other's actions. So this distrust is highly penetrated in the ties. So therefore, can we take a way forward from here? It is not just, the timing is it's of crucial. So there is no quick fix or quick solution to the problem. So now the challenges are much deeper. And therefore the dispute has wider ramifications. And that's where, the discussion today towards the Indonesian audience makes much more significant, or makes it more topical, or holds that credibility as to why we are discussing India-China today. Next slide, please. Now, when I put this dispute in a perspective, it is no more a dispute just at the border. The border is troubled by many other factors that comes into play and which actually act as external stimulus. And at the apex of all that is China-Pakistan nexus, the collusive actions which are often perceived it comes into being, because China and Pakistan share an all-weather friendship, and that has only become stronger over time. They have upgraded it to, the military. The military ties are increasingly stronger, and they have led to that of military integration. So increasingly, these trends make it far more profound, or what impact can it play in terms of India in the dispute between India and China, because there are apprehensions that thereafter, it gives enough reason that for Pakistan and China to come together to tackle a common threat in India. And China-Pakistan economic corridor therefore gives that credibility to China to directly get into a conflict if there is an Indo-Pakistan conflict taking into place. And why is it so? Because even if China isn't won, but to protect its strategic assets in CPEC, it might be a reason enough for China to enter into the conflict. So that brings into perspective. Secondly, China's activities in the Indo. Can you please check the sound? I think so. It's echoing.
You can try it right now, Dr. Armita.
So China's activities in the Indian Ocean, which have taken the spotlight from the border in Pakistan, Hambantota, in Sri Lanka, Indian Navy's activities. You need to understand that Indian Ocean, there is no direct entry route for China into the Indian Ocean, but it is trying to enter into this, seeing it through its own allies in the region, like Pakistan, Myanmar, or so these are activities that are getting China into the Indian Ocean, which we see with the associated Pakistan, Bangladesh. These are creating, a different kind
As
strategic strategy base. As I say this,
excuse me, Dr. Amrita Jash, my apology. It seems like your signal is breaking. Your voice has been like chopped up and connections may be unstable at this time.
Dr. Amrita, I'm afraid that we cannot hear you right now. Can you try a little bit?
Can you hear
Yeah.
me?
No, I'm afraid we can't. I'm afraid we cannot. Can you try? No, we cannot hear you at all. No, we cannot. No, we cannot hear you. Can you try once more? No, we cannot hear your voice. No. No, I think we still have a problem with the voice, right?
My deepest apology, Dr. Amrita Jash. It seems your voice is breaking up in your end.
Okay, I think we can you try, Dr. Amrita? I think we cannot hear you, Dr. Jash. No, I'm afraid we cannot hear you at all. Maybe the signal is weak right now. And I'm afraid we're reaching the time. So I think okay, so I think because we cannot really hear Dr. Josh voice, this is so really unfortunate. So why don't maybe we can continue the talk during the Q&A sessions with Dr. Amrita, hoping that the signals will be better soon. So thank you very much, Dr. Josh, for your very interesting presentations. I think we do learn a lot from your presentation, comprehensive presentations. I do take notes that you've mentioned a lot of important things since the very historical background of the dispute and the escalations of the dispute within a certain period, statistics, and also what makes the disputes getting more and more complex due to the geopolitical nature of the regions, as well as the Pakistani and the China relationship. So thank you very much. And I think I note a very interesting quotes from Dr. Jash is that indeed the China rise is because of the China is getting stronger, but on the other hand, it's also create China insecurity, so to speak, with the neighbor and with the other power in the regions. So thank you very much, Dr. Jash. I would like to invite all the participants to put the questions in the chat box so that we will explore and read the questions during the Q&A sessions. So our third speaker, let me introduce our third speaker, is Bapak Agung Nurwijoyo, who is a lecturer at the International Relations Department at the Faculty of Social and Political Science at the Universitas Indonesia. Dr. Pak Nurwijoyo had earned his bachelor's degrees in international relations from Universitas Indonesia in 2012, and he had also earned a master's degrees from Gazi University in Ankara, Turkey. So we would like to hear more on Indonesian perspective to this dispute as well from Pak Nurwijoyo. So without any further ado, Pak Agung Nurwijoyo, all the time is yours. 30 minutes, Pak.
Okay, thank you, Mas Aristio, Mr. Aristio. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank you for FPCI UI for inviting me to this seminar entitled Analyzing the China-India Border Dispute, Developments and Consequences. And I do appreciate the committee due to the initiative in arranging this discussion. Sometimes we do seminars when the tensions or the issue is escalating. So I think this is a good step and good and very constructive to discuss about this issue. And I also really enjoy listening and learning from the experts about this issue. Especially for Professor Babuns and Dr. Jash. And I hope that someday we can meet an offline discussion. And also for moderator, Mr. Aristio, for moderating this seminar as the party. Oops.
Kakak. Ayah, sini jadi mana?
Tes. Hello.
Yes, we can hear you, Pak Agung.
I'm sorry. Okay. Wait a minute. Okay, you can clear to hear me?
Yes, very clear, Pak. No worries.
Okay. Okay, I would like to continue. I think after listening to speakers, to experts, I think it's very, very interesting. Yeah. From Professor Babuns, he started his thought, his presentations with the 1955 Bandung Conference. In the last 3 years, I also had the research about social cooperation, where 1955 Bandung Conference was the undivided part of it, and the spirit of solidarity and many principles that this conferences conduct is very important. And I'm not sure does this spirit is still alive at the heart of every country that attend the conference in 1955 regarding to the many issues that happen with the countries who become a part of this conference at the time. And I think also Dr. Jess also giving us the bridge to understanding about the dispute in details. To be honest, some of her thought is similar with my presentation. I hope I do not too much repetition of her thought. Instead, this is a very dynamic discussion. And there are always pros and cons. And I choose the title for my presentation as India-China Border Dispute, Urban Relationship, question mark. And we need to realize that the stand of regarding to the issue of India and China border dispute is the culmination of the tensions between two neighborhood countries over territory that has been contested for more than 4 decades. Next, please. I have 4 points to discuss: clash in the border, historical context, complex relationship, and the conclusions. Next, please. I start my presentation with the title "Clash in the Loose Border." We realized that the tensions between India and China, especially in Galwan Valley, turned deadly on June 2020. There were 20 Indian personnel dead at that time, and in one of the reports said 40 Chinese personnel also dead at the time. And both countries were blaming each other for the clashes in that area, and tension also happened on the loose border. The shared border is marked by the existence of the line actual control, or LAC, between India and China. And as you know, LAC connected with the British colonial era. We remember, as Dr. Jess also mentioned, about the McMahon line that was drawn in 1914 between the borders of Tibet and India. And in the historical context, after the British partition, the Indian subcontinent, New Delhi, accepted the McMahon line as its sovereignty, as its boundary with China. And this line also rejected by the Beijing. Beijing refused to accept the lines drawn by the British. And until now, the status quo is continued. Both countries relatively do not have a consensus about the border. And it is still becoming a dispute and standoff until now. Next. And about the historical context, basically, both countries, India and China, shared a very long history of mistrust and conflict along the borders. And tensions flared in 2020 was the first deadly clash in more than 4 decades. And I would like to start with one of the milestones regarding to this issue. In 1959, Nehru's 1959 visit to Beijing. And as you know, after the British partition of the Indian subcontinent in 1947, it gave a very huge consequences on the regional developments. This reality is not only about the India's relation with his brother, with her brother, Pakistan, but also the other countries in the region, but also with China. And partition in 1947 also marked by the rising intention toward the issue of Kashmir, which is included China in this dispute border. And after the Mao Zedong proclaims China as the People's Republic of China, I think this is the time as the momentum where China and India aware of their own sovereignty, their borders. We are fully understanding that after the independence, the priorities of the government, usually domestic power consolidations, and after that, step by step, started to give such a concern about the other issue regarding to the sovereignty. And also in this issue, in India and China issue, this condition also conducted by China's initiative to build roads in the western sector. And of course, India giving protest about Beijing's move. And then this concern was shown by Beijing by sending its troops to Tibet and takes control of mountainous Tibet. But in 1959, also Dalai Lama, the Tibetan Buddhist spiritual leader, is granted asylum in India. And in 1959 and 59, also before the visit of Nehru's to Beijing, territory in Sikkim and Bhutan, and tension were escalating, influenced by Beijing declaration over the. And Beijing, as I said to you before, that never accepted the New Delhi's 14 boundary of McMahon line. And those lists of issues was discussed during Nehru's visit to India. And Nehru questioned boundaries on official Chinese maps. And at the time, the discussion between China and India between Nehru and Zhou Enlai at the time is a little bit hard because because Beijing Prime Minister Zhou Enlai at the time said that China will not accept the colonial frontier. So I think this is one of the critical situation here, because as we know, the perception of the border between the Western and Eastern is really different. And 1962, we moved to the Sino-Indian War. War breaks out in the area named Aksai Chin, in Kashmir. Aksai Chin, however, is a very, very strategic corridor linking Tibet to Western China. At the time, during that war, in Sino-Indian War, India lost the war. And this war was conducted in 4 weeks. That left thousands of people dead on Indian side. And at that time, as far as I know, China changed its neutral stance over Kashmir and throw support behind Pakistan over the issue. In 1967, we have Natula conflict. This is India's highest mountain in northeastern Sikkim state. And in this clash, approximately 80 Indian soldiers died at the time. And in 1975, we have another skirmishes, Tulungla ambush between India and China in the border, where in this situation, 4 Indian soldiers died, and Delhi at the time believed that Beijing crossed into the Indian territory, and this claim dismissed by the China. And in 2017, we have Doklam Plateau standoff, but between 1975 until 2017, of course, there's a lot of skirmishes happen. As can you see in the presentation of Dr. Jash, but happen in the low level. But many things also happen. For example, like Beijing refused New Delhi's claim of dispute Arunachal Pradesh as a state of the Union government in 1985. And the tension in Doklam Plateau is triggered by the construction of the road by China in that area. This area, Doklam Plateau, is one of the area that have strategic significance to China. But this issue then resolved after the talks. And the last one, in 2020, we have Ladakh confrontation, as I have a little bit mentioned in the first slide there. It happened in June 2020 in Galwan Valley and on Himalayan frontier. Approximately 20 Indians personnel died at that time, and it makes the issue become much more escalating. But something that we have to realize that this relationship is not, we cannot see this is something single matter regarding to the issue of the India and China relationship. As Dr. Jas also mentioned, we need also regarding to the complexity of this relationship, we also need to connect and trying to understand about the bigger picture between the relation between India and China. And I would like to show to you about this complex of relationship between two countries. Next slide, please. And I only mentioned, underline two bigger, the bigger picture about it, about the BRI and the presence of the China in South Asia, and the second one, Pakistan as China's ally. And about the first point about the BRI, Belt Road Initiative, and the presence of the China in South Asia, we realized that about the border issue is a part of the complex relation between China and India. And the recent development is giving us so much consequences to the relation between two countries. and somehow we sometimes need to the basic understanding of the international politics written by Morgenthau about every country need to struggling for power. Yeah. By this understanding, I think the recent development is also important to take notes. And the first one about the BRI and the China's initiative with the Belt Road Initiative, directly or not, is building a distrust from India. In this situation, China is building roads, railroads to many regions, including South Asia, like Pakistan, and this is one of the important issue. Not only about the Pakistan, not only about the land, also from the sea. The India existence in the Indian Ocean is threatened by the presence of the China. And maybe you ever heard also about the String of Pearls plan. This is such an expansion is planned by the Beijing, and it pushes the China's assertiveness toward many regions, including South Asia. And so far, in this issue, China enlarged its maritime capability. And besides that, China also built maritime cooperation with Sri Lanka, with Pakistan, with Bangladesh, and they cooperate in building ports that makes the position of India becomes a little bit difficult. And we can say that China's strategy in South Asia is a part of economic, military, diplomacy, and political strategy hand in hand with its vision. And this situation also is making India not in a comfortable situation. India, however, we realize that India is the regional power in South Asia. If we read the books from Barry Buzan and Ole Weber, Regions and Power, he said that he explained about the regional security complex in South Asia. He said that South Asia is built by two regional powers. The first one is India, and the second one is Pakistan. So when we realized that when we realized that China exists in the South Asia, and we realized that China is Pakistan's ally, so this situation becomes problematic for the India. Of course, we also know that we understand that this issue also influenced by the other issue. Not only these two issues, it's only for the intermezzo. India also has intention building Tibet a strategic buffer between India and China, and also issue of water and etc. But back to the topic about this issue, about the power issue. I think it's also important for us to take a note with the second point, Pakistan as a China's ally. There's a lot of articles, journals, opinions, talking and discuss about the relation, the alliance between Pakistan and China. One of the articles that I read that China-Pakistan relations is all-weather friendship. And if I remember one of the articles written by Kaura in 2018, in her article mentioned that China and Pakistan often describe their friendship as higher than mountains, deeper than oceans, stronger than steel, and sweeter than honey. So it means the relationship between two countries, between China and the Pakistan, is really, really, how do I say, it's always a friendship, China giving such a moral, material, intelligence support to Pakistan. Also mentioned by the Dr. Jas, also mentioned about the China-Pakistan economic corridor. China also plan to build road in Pakistan, control Kashmir region. And this is something that makes a little bit position of India not only difficult, but insecure. So this is something that we also need to realize. So a little bit important for us regarding to this issue of the dispute is really hard for India if the third party is a Pakistan, because the ally between Pakistan and China. Yeah. And this is the complex relationship. So we realize that the issue of the dispute is not a single matter in regarding to this to the South Asia region. I think, in my opinion, if Dr. Josh also mentioned that China and India border dispute is the regional hotspot, I think we need to add as not only that things. I think the regional hotspots in the South Asia, not only between China and India, but also India with his former brother Pakistan. We also know Jammu and Kashmir until now very problematic, very problematic. Different with different with the Ladakh. That's highest one of the mountainous area. Jammu and Kashmir is a very beautiful place here. So I think this is, but strategically speaking, the geopolitically, this area is really important, even for India, for Pakistan, and also for China. It's like a natural barrier for each country. And jump to the conclusion, I think. Next slide, please. Okay. I cannot say that this is a perennial conflict. We do not know that what will be happen in the future, but more and more conflict tensions are open to flare up. I fully agree with Professor Salvatore Babuns. Yeah. And this is very highly a strategic zone, relatively, even though, yeah, relatively no civilian population. But this is very strategic area between the dispute, and the tension between China and India also triggered by the legacy of colonialists. So that's why points of McMahon line is important. And so the turbulent relationship, I think, between the countries are influenced by complexity in relationship, not only about this border dispute, but also triggered by the other issue that push the India much more having such a security dilemma with the China. And also two countries between India and China, I think need a very long, deep, constructive, and intensive conversation to end this stand of problems here. And for Indonesia, I think Indonesia needs to encourage the two countries to have such a dialogue to avoid the conflict without take a side or with the principle of neutrality. I think that's all for my presentation, Mas Aristio. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Pak Agung, for the very interesting presentations, and also a very important one. I do take notes for a lot of several important points that you make. And I think I do agree with you, and I think also as what Dr. Jas mentioned earlier, that the dispute is very complex in nature, right? So it's not only a conflict, and as you say, it's not a only conflict between India and Pakistan, but it's also the involvement of not only India and China, but involvement of Pakistan in the dispute also complicate the settlement of dispute in between China and India. So I think we shall proceed to the next sessions, which is the Q&A sessions. We do have a number of questions here lined up in the chat box. So I will read some of them. So I think just to make it more easier for the speaker to answer the questions, so I think I will ask the questions one by one, and then the speakers will address the questions briefly, so we can accommodate more questions for the Q&A. So I think the first questions is from Rifki Harazi from Universitas Indonesia. The questions is, are there any mechanisms to avoid the escalations to these perfect storms currently employed by China, India, or other external parties? And if there isn't, what kind of mechanism should be employed? So will there be any specific mechanisms to mention to keeping peaceful in the dispute? So maybe we start with Dr. Jash.
Thank you for the question, and I hope I'm audible now without any glitch.
Audible.
We can hear you.
Yeah, nice to meeting you, and thank you for the presentation. And sorry for the glitch by the end of my presentation. So far as we are seeing that, there is no ideal mechanism, because what was set in portion was the protocols. As I reiterated, they have been null and void. So now there is a greater need for, much stronger protocols and to abide by the protocols. And it can't be that only one party abides by it and the other party not. And as we see that, China has a tendency of putting the onus on the other, that you are responsible and that's why I react. And I think so there is, as Professor earlier mentioned, that, we need to come to the table and talk the tough questions and not shy away. That is at the first stage that we are needed to be. Already we have done the phase 1 disengagement, but the critical times comes now with the phase 2, where the song is where the critical point lies, as we have huge perception difference. No.
So we cannot hear you clearly. Okay.
The ideal mechanism is a far-fetched thought as of now. So,
okay.
So I'll just end up on that. I think.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Jash. Pak Agung?
Okay. This. Okay. I agree with Dr. Jash. There's no such ideal mechanism about this to finish this issue. Yeah. I think both countries also trying to make this issue become such a status quo. I mean, like issue in the Jammu and Kashmir, the situation is a little bit quite similar. So that's why in the near future, I think I a little bit not see a clear way out about this issue, but both countries is trying to make this issue become such a still in the status quo.
Right. Thank you very much, Pak Agung. So the next question is from Rifki Fernanda from Universitas Jenderal Sudirman. How's Nepal government reactions to the contested regions? Because Nepal is a neighbor of the two nations, and how Nepal government would do when the conflict broke out. Lastly, is Russia a good relationship with India until now is caused by their arms and industries and military cooperations? What's your take on that? Maybe let's start with Pak Agung first.
Okay, thank you. We have to realize, as I mentioned before, that the South Asia is built up by the two regional powers, India and Pakistan, and the situation of the other countries in the South Asia, even though yes important, but not so impactful, I think. So, however, every issue in the South Asia put those two countries, India and Pakistan, as the key factors about the peace process, about how the stability in the region. I think that things that we have to realize, Mas Aristio.
All right, Dr. Jash.
Yeah, I'll address the Nepal question. What is Nepal's reaction? However, we see that there is a behavioral change in Nepal with the political leadership that comes in. Like when it's under the Oli government, we see there was a greater divide between India and Nepal. But under the MAK, when there is the communist under Prachanda, there's a closer ties between India and Nepal. So the political leadership actually becomes a deciding factor that where do you tilt your ties towards, especially in the context of, India's peripheries. That is very significant. And we see that under BRI, China's closeness to Nepal has expanded over time. And be it infrastructure build-up and, infusing of money through public diplomacy, Nepal is becoming the front runner of Chinese entry into this region, both in territorial terms because Nepal is landlocked, and in terms of maritime terms through Pakistan, through Bangladesh, through Sri Lanka, Myanmar. So these are how it works. And on Russia and India ties, I think so it is not just about the defense. Of course, that is the strongest pillar. But we go back to during Cold War times, there was, when the 1962 war was happening, Nehru's ties with then Russia or Soviet Union and United States, there was some kind of confidence in India that if a conflict erupts, both the superpowers will come to help. But unfortunately, they themselves got caught in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So we don't know if the situation would have been any different if the Cuban Missile Crisis didn't happen. So yes, defense industry is one of the critical factors, but that is also propping major issues because China is not happy with Russia selling S-400 to India, and neither is United States. So.
Thank you, Dr. Josh. So there's one related questions specifically for Dr. Josh, but I think I will invite Pak Agung if you want to add some more answers. So it's from Christine from Universitas Pajajaran. Dr. Armida, I would like to ask questions. Can you elaborate more on the effect of the China's activities in South Asian neighborhood on the China-India border dispute? So the presence of China in general in South Asian regions and how it affects to specifically on the border dispute.
Thank you for that question because, when your periphery, your region, even if Indonesia is directly not involved in the South China Sea, that case, but you will feel the remnants, right? Like the after effects are felt. Similarly, when you put it in the South Asian context, what is China trying to achieve? There is a bigger question because in this so far, we see that there was one regional actor in South Asia, that is India being, the dominion over here. And then you see an external actor coming in form of China, which is trying to, appease or form a Chinese club through its public diplomacy, be it through infrastructure, financing, or opening of Chinese Confucius institutes, which has become a bigger propagandizing machine. So, you can do an information warfare, you can do a psychological warfare. So warfare has taken a different domain. It's not just about bullets or firearms anymore. We are talking, and China today is trying to say that let's go a level high towards intelligized warfare. So when you create, bigger divides in your own region, like we see one example I can draw when Nepal, came up with a constitution that created a divide between Nepal and India at that time. Which country came and first supported Nepal? It was China. That, we are so proud of you. So that you can see that the dividing lines, and China is encroaching every other, or rather creating more divides between the parties, which is, of course, at the advantage of China. And at the end of the day, it festers more into the India-China border dispute because you are keeping India engaged and you are alienating India in the thing. So I think so.
All right, Pak Agung, you want to add?
Okay, I want to add something, but the question I think similar with the question from Ranga, is quite similar. I think the effect of activities in border dispute and also the impact, the relation. Also, I think it enlarge or increase the distrust. This is very critical, I think. The increasing of China's activities in South Asia with its own project with BRI, building roads, building railroads, and also building ports, for example. It's making the India, in my opinion, becomes much more insecure in these situations. That's why India is trying to make such a balancing. It's very important point when Mas Aristio also at the beginning also mentioned about the Quad. Yeah, I think Quad also, even though not so, I don't know in the future, but it is like an effort for India to make such a new balancing in the region. Why about as we know that why India not join RCEP? Yeah, it's because of China. So I think the increasing of activities of China in the region, in the South Asia, for example, but it's logically it increased the uncomfortable situation for the India, and it makes such an increase the distrust also. And also, it's the direct consequences. It makes such a difficult for talking about the how to make a peace agreement. So that's why it becomes like what I said before, status quo. Thank you.
So thank you, Pak Agung. So we have quite an interesting questions from Dewa Yogananda from Universitas Indonesia regarding the role of the United Nations. Why is the United Nations not respond more strongly toward the flare-up? Shouldn't they at least attempt to mediate the dispute? And secondly, assuming that either side backs down, regardless of the unlikeliness that is, what would happen to China and India internally and externally? So the first regarding the role of the UN, and then the second is what if each party doesn't want to back off? What would happen? We go with Pak Agung maybe.
Okay, thank you. But the United Nations, I think United Nations giving such a response, but limited response, I think, because of, yes, we know this issue is about the security issue. And every security issue is discussed by the Security Council, and it becomes very difficult because of China is a part of it. Yeah. So I think this is very, very difficult situation also for the United Nations about these situations. And the second one, assuming either side backs down, regardless of how unlikely that is, what would happen to China and India internally and externally? Yeah, I think yeah, this is also something complex and strategic situation. Yeah, there's a lot of consequences about it. That that India and also China needs to rethinking about it, and I think it doesn't mean that the problem is over because of because of the situation of distrust between two countries has been happened and built in the decades. So that's why. I also push to make such a deep, constructive, and long conversation between those two countries, I think. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Pak Agung. Dr. Josh, you want to add something?
Yeah, I would just go with the next second question, which is far more important, that if both China and India will back down. Firstly, there is no chances of backing down anymore. There are no room for any more concessions. China, we knew one can read China's behavior. There's no concession in terms of China. And also taking note that so far, China has 14 land border disputes, of which 12 it has settled. And in some cases, it has actually given more. But you need to consider that China will not do the same when it comes to India. And Bhutan, of course, given the protectorate of India. China won't do because your strategic interests lie when it comes to India, unlike any other country. So when your strategic interests, like, Aksai Chin or Tawang, when you say Arunachal, Tawang, it's a big victory card for China to appease the Tibetan population, which is having its own internal problems with Tibet, with Xinjiang. Now, whether backing down, so since there are no question, now we also need to understand both the countries are equally nationalist right now. Any kind of backing down will come as, a loss of face, because there is a lot of reputation costs involved. So because we see under this Modi's leadership, we had to. So it's going hand in hand, like, so there is I think China is very clear that India is not backing down, and India is not the old India of Nehru.
Thank you very much, Dr. Josh. So next we have a question specifically for Mr. Agung from Robi Kusuma, Universitas Pertamina. So why does Indonesia need to be involved in a dispute between the two countries? How important is it for Indonesia to be involved in the dispute? And the last one is, how will it affect Indonesia in the eyes of the world if it is involved in the dispute? Thank you.
Okay.
So more on the role Indonesia in the
Okay.
dispute, Pak.
Okay. I want to be a little bit optimistic about it, yeah, because in the historical level, we realize that a very, very long history. For example, when before we know about the Indonesia itself, when we are still Nusantara, when we are still have Majapahit, Sriwijaya, at that time, Sriwijaya as the as a connection between in the maritime between the kingdoms in the India. We know that there were Chandragupta like that, and many kingdom in the China. Yeah, we know that the relation between China and India in the past century is very, very limited by the land because of the natural barrier from the Himalayan. But their connection is from the Sriwijaya. The students, as far as I know, the students from India, when they want to go to China, they need to learn about the Chinese language like that in Sriwijaya. And for the Chinese students who wants to go to the India, they learn about the language also in Sriwijaya. So this is one of the example. And the other example, as we know, in terms of the issue of Asia and African conferences, Indonesia is the only country that can making two confrontative countries like India and Pakistan sit together. Yeah, Nehru and Ali Jinnah sitting together, and also with the China. And this is maybe a little bit hyperbolic and very, very optimistic, but I think these things. But we need to have about it. Yeah, even though it's hard. Yes, it's hard, and somehow because of interest, for example. We are much more choosing to be much more neutral. Neutral means just only very have limited steps, only giving such as, for example, when China and India have a dispute border in June 2020, as far as I remember that Minister of Foreign Affairs, Pak Tengku Faizasyah, only giving such a statement that yeah, we urge two countries to be to have such a dialogue, trying to de-escalating the conflict, trying to ceasefire, etc., without the further step. So it's very, very limited. But these things is happen based on the political will of the state. I think how about the posture of the foreign policy itself. Because of today's is a little bit different with the few years ago in 1955. And a few century ago, like that, I think.
So okay, thank you very much, Pak Agung. So the next question just goes to Dr. Josh specifically. So what is the demographic of the people living in the disputed zones, if there are any? What nationality do they consider themselves as, and what role do they play in the dispute itself? I'm aware that there is mentions already that the dispute is actually quite a remote area, but do you have any answer for this question?
Of especially in Aksai Chin, where the Galwan Valley, it's a completely no man's land. You don't have any habitation except for, now you just have petrol postings or just the military troops that are positioned there. And to that of life, it reminds me of Mao's statement that, Aksai Chin is a place where not even a blade of grass is there. So that's how can you have human habitation? But Arunachal is the place where you have, and we are seeing that China is creating villages now. That's where it's slowly we are seeing satellite imageries of creating villages, and pushing into Han population in that area. Again, an important aspect is of the Sichuan Tibet Railway that is coming up, which will be a magnanimous project which will run through this LAC around the Arunachal sector. And it will again, so there is a greater mobilization in terms of bringing the Han Chinese in, or rather logistic support. At any point of time when there's a crisis, you just mobilize the troops as soon as possible. And it took traction just immediately in last year, November, when Xi Jinping declared fast-track the process. In the 14th five-year plan, they said that this has to be completed. So it's a major project that one needs to look at. Infrastructure today has become one of the key points, which is actually augmenting the dispute. Every dispute is coming from where infrastructure build-up. And infrastructure build-up is fortification. So that's how I read it.
Thank you, Dr. Josh. I have a short follow-up questions. Though I was wondering, how is the public perceptions in India towards China? Because the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore recently released a survey on how the ASEAN citizens' perspective towards China, and most of them, considering what happened in the regions like South China Sea and etc., most of ASEAN citizens perceive China more as a threat rather than opportunities, and they see quite cynical towards China. I was wondering though, how was the Indian citizens' perspective toward China? Was it still positive or some sort of negative by nature?
The relations actually, hit the lowest than other last year. You can see that there was a huge public resistance, be it to the products, Chinese products. Now people have become very reluctant, or rather it's like a behavior that we don't buy Chinese products. It's kind of protest towards what China has done. So this has really taken traction. Plus the government's approach of banning of apps. So the China and the Indian people, especially in a kind of pandemic you are encroaching, this was uncalled for, where it is not an attitude that one will float, and especially when China aspires to become a major power. Firstly, there was already talks going on over the Wuhan epidemic, and then this comes in. So it's a double, a twin play done by China, the very uncalled situation, so which will not be forgiven or to be forgotten. And it's the dent is much deeper, and it brings back 1962 very active, I think, so in both Chinese and Indian minds. But what I'll say that India was always aware of China, but in China, knowing India, perceiving India as a threat is gaining more grounds. So we see that greater India studies opening up, so there is greater awareness in China towards India that we are seeing a potential threat I think so that will be the one place one needs to read, that how are Chinese seeing Indians, because in a general NPO report of last year, we see that India is up in the game with US, Japan, India becoming ranked number 3 threat perception in Chinese. So that says it.
Thank you very much. That is very interesting one. So we have another questions from Dani Widiatmo from Universitas Indonesia. For both Pak Agung and Dr. Josh, what is the SAARC's role in the conflict? As we know that is the regional cooperations organizations in the regions. Thank you. So maybe we can start with Pak Agung and then Dr. Josh.
Okay, thank you. South Asia Association for Regional Cooperation is one of the important international organizations in South Asia. besides in South Asia, as far as I know. Maybe Dr. Jess can make it edit some thing also. In South Asia, there's also BIMSTEC, for example. And about this, the role of SIRC, I think it's very, very limited. Very, very limited regarding to the issue of trying to ease the conflict. Yeah. Moreover, this when this discussion is talking about the dispute between China and India, I think the situation also making such a very limited the role that can be played by the SRC, I think, for the making such a peaceful process in this issue, I think. So that's why I think the role is very, very limited. And they're trying to make this issue is ended by the not regional cooperation, but instead of using such a bilateral cooperation between two countries, bilateral trying to diplomacy between two countries, between India and China, instead of using regional organizations. I think that's my opinion.
Thank you very much, Pak Agung. Dr. Josh?
We need to understand SAARC is not a success story as that of ASEAN. So, that brings into SAARC is a defunct organization. And why is it so? Because you have India and Pakistan over there who are themselves troubled with a long territorial dispute. So who is going to chair? But SAARC only took traction again under the pandemic. The situation called for, and India took the charge of calling for a virtual meeting, going for a COVID vaccine. So or a COVID fund that was created, some kind of traction it took only under the pandemic situation. But there is nothing tangible. When we come to all these territorial disputes, it's not at all functional. So we can't compare. There is no comparison to other multilateral frameworks.
Right. So thank you very much. So I think I will go to the last questions. I understand that the border dispute is in the very nature, it's a very complex issues that involving legal questions and also geopolitical tensions. But we're looking forward. What do you think that is very much important to maintain peace and security between the two countries and also the South Asian regions in a broader context? Is it better for only both countries that solve the dispute, or would it be necessary for a third parties, for example, invite the US or Russia to help in mediating the dispute? So the question is, what it really needs to enhance peaceful and security in the disputed area? So let's start with Pak Agung first, and then Dr. Josh.
Okay, thank you, Mas Aristio. I think not all of the conflict or dispute around the world need to be 100% resolved. Yeah, sometimes because of how do I say? Because of there's a lot of variables that, for example, in this issue in China and India border dispute, it's not only happened in 1 or 2 years ago. It has been happened in decades. If we are trying to much more longer, it is one of the impact of the post-colonialist legacy. 1914 McMahon Alliance. If we much more got more deeper about this understanding. If you've ever heard about the Westphalia in 1648, this is such an inertia of the Westphalia. When the inertia of the Western countries at that time is trying to have an understanding that every countries, the borders, the power of every countries, how to build their own sovereignty, it marked by the border, the very strict border. But this understanding, in my opinion, is really different with the kingdom, the countries from the eastern. For example, it's like a universe. In India, they have Chandragupta with one of the thinkers, as one of the thinkers that I've ever heard and read the articles, the very ancient articles, Kautilya. Yeah. He mentioned many things, how to unite all of the kingdoms in South Asia. So it means there's a lot of very differences. So that's why, yeah, it becomes the status quo. It becomes the because of the differences, understanding between both countries. It's not only happen in the few years ago, but it happens decades, century. It becomes a problem. So that's why one of the important things that trying to have such a dialogue in the level of elite and also the public diplomacy about the this issue, because that's a thing that I can add, Mas Aristio.
Thank you very much, Pak Agung. Dr. Josh?
I think so. Thanks to that, both are nuclear powers, so the deterrence plays a very big role. In helping us maintain the relative peace and not declare all-out war. So the nuclear deterrence is very much a problem solver in some way, but when we a way forward, well, we have to first sit and discuss the maps. We have so far just done with the middle sector. That's why we say 2020. We see that in along the LSE, all the sectors have become simultaneously active. So now we can't say that whether Western sectors will be peaceful or Eastern sector. It is the entire LSE. So anything can happen at any point of time. No one thought of Galwan, taking place in one distant place. More complicated, and we can't have an external mediator. That will further complicate the process, because then alignment comes in. We maintain an independent foreign policy. We are a sovereign state. So getting a third-party intervention will never help. We didn't even do with Jammu and Kashmir. This is a different issue altogether, because these are two actors who have to solve it themselves. An external actor would only further, complicate the process, and a misfire can happen because that's where we see during 2020, we see, in Global Times report, China was constantly coming up with warnings that India shouldn't get closer to US, or the trade war shouldn't factor in. So they are constantly preventing that, US should stay off from this. So no one wants a third-party intervention, because third-party intervention cannot solve this issue. Did third-party intervention solve South China Sea? Did China respect the ICJ tribunal? No. And so all these factors come in. So it's maintain, momentum in de-escalation. Achieving that is the imminent need of both countries. That I withdraw my troops, I maintain that peace, that there is no misfire at any point of time. Because after this, if anything happens, that will be quite devastating. So.
Thank you very much, Dr. Josh. I think that is a very powerful remarks, and I do agree that in nearly all of the dispute, I think the best way to solve the dispute is with negotiations between two parties in the dispute. So I think thank you very much. It's been a really my pleasure to moderate this very wonderful and insightful panels to our very esteemed speakers. So I think I cannot really conclude our discussions, but a few points that I think we all agree that the dispute is very much important for the broader regions. Therefore, it has to be maintained a peace and security, not only for the parties in the dispute area, but also for the region as well. And I think, as we agreed earlier, I think the best way to really solve the dispute is between negotiations of the two parties, and not really have a third countries involved in the disputed area. So thank you very much, Dr. Amrita Josh and Pak Agung Rujoyo, for the very insightful presentations. I think we all learned so much from your presentations, and I'm apology if there's any mistaken from me in moderating this session. So thank you very much. So with that, I'll send it back to the Master of Ceremony. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Aristio Rizka Darmawan, for moderating this amazing, interesting, and very insightful discussion. We hope that all of our participants here can get many more fruitful insights and gain much more knowledge regarding the China-India border dispute and its implication on South Asian geopolitics. We would like to remind all of our participants today to fill the attendance form through the link that has been shared by the committee in the Zoom chat feature to claim your certificate of appreciation for all the participants. Next, as we have mentioned before, we will announce the best participant of FPCI Chapter A World in a Snap webinar analyzing the China-India border dispute developments and consequences. All right, because I've been waiting the entire day, the best participant award goes to... Congratulations, Dewa Yogananda, for being the best participant of this event. Thank you, Dewa Yogananda, for your great questions and for actively being involved into this discussion. Dewa Yogananda's question was regarding the role of the United Nations and on what if scenario if China and India does not back down and the demographics of the disputed area. The best participant will be contacted by the committee for the handover of the certificate. All right. So now we will have a quick photo session which will be documented by the Public Relations Division. So for all the speakers and participants, please kindly turn on your camera so we can capture all of your beautiful smile in today's wonderful event. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you, MC. So now we would like to have some take a picture for the sessions. We have 4 slides here, so you may please stand by for a while. For the first slide, 1, 2, and 3. Okay, second slide. The third slide. And at the last slide. Okay, thank you.
This photo session marks the end of the Day Wins webinar. A big token of gratitude goes to all of our speakers, Mr. Salvatore Babunis, Dr. Amrita Jash, and Mr. Agung Nurwijoyo, as well as our moderator, Mr. Aristio Rizka Darmawan, and of course, all of the participants who have joined us the webinar for today. Please don't forget to follow our social media and Instagram and at FPCI UE, Spotify and YouTube, FPCI Chapter UE, and Medium at FPCI.UE so that you won't miss our next works and publications. We sincerely await you in our future events. One of our latest releases is FPCI Chapter UE Podcast Foreign Affairs on Air, which is a brand new work program from our Opportunity and Development Division that will discuss the latest international issues as well as matters relating to foreign policy. The first episode of this podcast will present Kahafiz from Contextual as a resource person as well as involving active members of FPCI Chapter UE as co-hosts of the podcast. The premiere of the Foreign Affairs on Air podcast will air on Spotify at the end of April. My name is Muhammad Sharafi Hatta, signing off as the Master of Ceremony. Please accept my sincere apologies if I have any mistakes during the event. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Shalom. Om Shanti 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 Om. Namo Buddhaya. FPCI Chapter UE, Board of 2021. Thrive with Intelligence.